Hi everyone, my name is Sarah Morge. I use she, her pronouns, and I am an undergraduate communications major at the Pace University in Pleasantville. This is my third year working as a FIRE peer educator, which stands for Fighting Ignorance and Rape with Education. It is my third year working within the Office of Sexual and Interpersonal Wellness, and I'm starting my role as the Unity and Social Justice Ambassador, as well as the Vice President of the Women's Empowerment Group on campus. Today, we're going to talk to you a little bit about amplifying advocacy for the LGBTQIA+ community in the face of cis and heteronormative models in institutions.
Thanks, Sarah. My name is Rachel Simon. I use she and they pronouns. I am the interim director of the Office of Multicultural Affairs, also at Pace University in Pleasantville. We are within the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, which includes the Office of Sexual and Interpersonal Wellness. I also teach in the Women's and Gender Studies Department and run the LGBTQIA Center on campus. We put together this kind of quick conversation that we had imagined as a workshop where we were going to get together in small groups and talk about challenges and collaborate. Since we can't do that in a virtual space, I invite you to think about policies or roadblocks that you face as you work to advocate for TGNCNB, which stands for transgender, gender nonconforming, and non-binary, and other LGBTQIA+ people impacted by interpersonal harm, including sexual and dating violence. We're going to discuss some practices at our campuses, or our campus, singular, and organizations within a framework of intersectional inclusion. We want to think about things that have worked and ways to implement change. And we wanted to start by just thinking about the reasons that we do this work. And for me, it goes back to when I was an undergraduate and a student on my hall in the residence hall was sexually assaulted. And it was a small enough campus that everybody knew the story and knew what happened. And then also was very aware when the student who had sexually assaulted the woman on my hall faced no consequences. And then as an adult, that person who faced no consequences went on to have a kind of prominent job as a public figure and whose name was in the news. And it kind of served as a reminder, right, that the system doesn't work, that people don't feel protected. And working in higher ed since 2003, I have found, that was me not doing math, of subtracting 3 from the year. I have found myself really looking at ways that we can focus on prevention, because it would be great if we didn't need the Department of Ed and its policies around sexual and interpersonal violence, and we could really have less of it all around. How about you, Sarah?
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much share the same sentiment. I do this work. It's important to me and it's important to the people around me. As a cisgendered woman, I have the opportunity and the privilege to try and transform these spaces into welcoming and, open communities for folks of all sexual orientation or gendered identities. And going into college, you hear statistics, you hear, these things happen, but then to realize that it's happening on your own campus with people that is a whole different feeling. And so being able to use my tiny platform as a peer educator at Pace, I am so thankful that I'm able to educate other people and work in prevention for sexual violence.
I will add thank you for that, Sarah. Another reason I'm thinking about is that there just aren't great relationship models in the media. And over again, we see things in like the most popular movies around that just show dangerous models of relationships. So hopefully we're pushing back against that with some of our education. And thinking specifically about the LGBTQIA+ community, a challenge that we face is that we often aren't raised by people within our own identities, right? So as a Jewish person, I was raised by Jewish parents. A lot of Caribbean people are raised by Caribbean parents, right? Like we have the model of what that looks like. And I have cisgender heterosexual parents. They never struggled with coming out. They never had to figure out if their hanging out was friendly or a date. They were, it was the 1960s and people said, would you like to go on a date? And they said yes. So I love that some of this work helps to more fully flesh out what is possible for young people, and especially queer and trans young people. So we want to move now into a couple of examples, kind of more practical examples. And one thing that I have experienced in my work with college students is trans students who experience gender dysphoria, and that dysphoria is exacerbated by physical intimacy or romantic and sexual relationships, right? And students are often very direct and say like, it is a bad day for my dysphoria, or maybe they're not talking about it and they're focused on an upcoming chemistry exam. So being aware of kind of the ebbs and flows of that is important, but then also the barriers to support that trans students might face on top of their other intersectional identities, right? Like you still have your racial identity and your class identity and, your identity as a part-time worker at the coffee shop, right? Like all of that is still there on top of your gender identity and expression. So thinking about a student looking for support, they might go to your organization or your office and find that it has all cisgender staff. You might work in a healthcare setting where they have to use their legal name because that's what's connected to their medical insurance. So maybe they're being dead named. Maybe people are using the wrong pronouns for them. And then like, what does the physical infrastructure look like? Is the gender binary being reinforced in your residence halls, in bathrooms, right? I think with a low level of underlying fear of family rejection, we see that trans folks, gender nonconforming and non-binary people really need not extra support, but support to meet them where they are with support. So some things that you can do. Here are the practical tips. Make sure that you're not making assumptions about people's identities, right? If you're asking for and honoring people's names and pronouns, use what they're telling you. And you might need to say like, I need your legal, we need to make sure that your legal name appears here or there. And that, is how magical medical insurance works. But if you don't need that, then, you should never be using it. And even if you need the information, you don't need to be, you shouldn't be sharing that information with anyone else. Know kind of where the single stall, all gender bathrooms are within your realm. Listen to and follow the language examples from the people you're working with. And I have a great podcast recommendation if you are a podcast person. So the language podcast, The Allusionist, that's ALLUSIONIST, The Allusionist, has an episode called Joins, which is number 56, because I just looked it up, where the podcast host interviews transgender, gender nonconforming, and non-binary people about the language they use for their body parts. And it's great to hear in the voice of, from within the community, people talking about, I use this language with someone I'm sexually attracted to, and I use this language with my doctor, and I use this language in these situations. So look at the practical side of what you're doing, forms and intake material, what language and examples peer support networks or workshops are using, so that you've got like a robust and inclusive model. And now I feel like I've talked for long enough, and I'm going to pass it back to Sarah.
Thank you. So the next example we're going to look at is that of a closeted person. So this can be of any gender or sexuality. Think non-binary, gender non-conforming, intersex, trans, pansexual, lesbian, etc. So in this case, folks are not going to be seeking support. That can feel very isolating. They lack those positive relationship models, and it takes longer to build relationships with friends and find that support network that they're looking for. So tips that we would give in this situation is to use a variety of different identities within your work. So you want to make sure that you're including trans, queer, non-binary, etc., all these identities so that they feel less isolated. You want to assume that there are folks of every identity in the room unless you are told otherwise. You also, like Rachel said, you want to follow the person's lead through language and follow and mirror what they are presenting for themselves. You also want to provide positive models in programming and in selecting peer support students. At PACE, as I mentioned earlier, I am a part of the peer educator program. So it is a group of trained students who are there to provide peer support to students on campus, and that is available to any and everyone. And it's also really important to identify the institutional barriers that you have and seek to rework them. I'm going to use an example that Rachel used just a minute ago about the gender binary taking place in residence halls or bathrooms. These are barriers that you are able to rework and alter so that they are no longer a barrier to support that these students might be feeling within your institution. So as Rachel mentioned, we weren't able to do a one-on-one workshop the way that we had initially planned. So we want to make sure that we can conclude with some tips that you're able to take away from this and hopefully implement within your own work and institution and try to have a more thoughtful way of working. So the first one is to build partnerships on and off campus. An example of this at PACE is we work with the Putnam Northern Westchester Women's Resource Center. This is a really great resource that we often have come onto campus. So they work within, the fire peer educator system as well as the women's empowerment group, and they can support students and lead to internships and jobs in a way that our campus can't. So it's really great for students to see that there are other resources outside of the PACE community, just 5 minutes up the road, that they're able to go to for support, for workshops, for help, or whatever they may need.
I will add that part of the benefit of those partnerships is also that those organizations are often looking for access to community members. And if you invite them in to partner with you, they are, they have access to your community and you have access to their staff and expertise, which can often be a great, a great thing. So next in our suggestions is to think about ways that you can not just signal inclusion, right? That you're not just showing kind of a diversity of relationship models, maybe in a brochure or on a website, but that in your people, your policies, and your practices, you're really making sure that there is authentic representation. Because, right, it's easy to use clip art that represents something, but that Google search doesn't necessarily mean that that's what's happening within your offices and your organizations.
The next thing that I think is important to point out is to identify and dismantle the barriers, as I had said before. So aside from just bathrooms and residence halls, it's also within staff and within language that is used. You want to make sure that you're using inclusive language that includes everybody, or you're requiring everybody to participate in sharing their pronouns. You want to do things that don't single anyone out in particular, and that is creating a safer space for everybody in the community.
In terms of making mistakes, because this is hard work and things change, right? We learn what works better. We learn how to better support people. And often we learn those things by making mistakes. So know that we'll make mistakes. And this is something that we're hearing a lot of language around within anti-racism work, that when you hear the feedback where somebody says, you know, you didn't give a content warning and I was unable to engage with your program as a result. When you hear that kind of criticism, that you really welcome it and you're open to it and you look at ways that you can improve, because you know situations are going to come up that are unfamiliar, that you're untrained for, and you're going to do your best, and hopefully that is perfect, but once in a while, right, it's not going to be. So really practice being open to that criticism and open to those opportunities for growth, because we are all going to have them.
Self-care is also an extremely important thing to implement in routine, not just for students, but also for those working within an institution. And while, you know, self-care, you might picture an ice cream and a face mask, it's really important to implement self-care into everyday routines and prioritize your physical, mental, and emotional health. This work can be really taxing, it can be draining. And so you want to make sure that, you know, students along with you yourself are able to take a step back and prioritize your own health and make sure that you're okay and able to do the work that you're setting out to do.
Thank you. So our last suggestion is to think about ways that you can expose your community to relationship models that counter the messages of interpersonal harm, including sexual and dating violence. I think in our culture right now, domestically especially, there is a lot of attention paid around queer and trans people of color, talking about high murder rates and challenges with employment and turning to sex work as a necessity. Um, those things are true. You know, there are people, um, being murdered at disproportionate rates, but also think about finding models of joy and ways to amplify and honor those as well. And I think those are an easy thing to crowdsource often, where you can just ask around and say, like, what are those joyful relationship models and who's being represented, and then think about programming around those. To conclude our time together, we just want to share our contact information. Hopefully you will be in touch. We will see you in some of the virtual Spectrum rooms during this conference, but my name is Rachel Simon, and my email address, I'm going to see if I can rename myself, my email address on the fly. My email address is rsimon@pace.edu, which there it is right there. And I look forward to hearing from you.
I am doing the same for FIRE. Again, my name was Sarah Morge. I am a FIRE peer educator on the Pleasantville campus. If you ever wanted to reach out to a peer educator or our great advisor or do any work within the Office of Interpersonal and Sexual Wellness, fire@pace.edu would be where you want to reach out.
Thanks so much for your time, and we look forward to seeing you in person next year.
Bye.